Gaslight shimmered across the vaulted ceiling of Harrington Hall, casting trembling gold upon chandeliers, pearl-bright shoulders, and the brittle smiles of England's most accomplished daughters. Music floated like perfumed breath through the crowded ballroom, yet Eleanor Ashcombe stood apart, a solitary figure cloaked in dignity too fragile for ornament, too proud for despair. At 28, she was already spoken of as a sorrowful relic, the eldest sister rendered invisible by the scandalous offense of remaining unmarried. Her younger sisters glided past her on jeweled arms, laughter chiming like silver bells as they accepted the praises of influential lords, their futures already embalmed in gold-threaded promises. Eleanor murmured polite felicitations, her voice soft, her posture immaculate, though each word tasted faintly of resignation. It was not envy that hollowed her breath, but the familiar knowledge that society had composed its verdict long before she dared imagine her own reprieve. Near the refreshment table, a baroness of notable severity allowed her gaze to linger upon Eleanor's modest gown and then drift deliberately away, as though acknowledging her presence might compromise decorum. A young viscount, previously assigned as her dancing partner, approached only to bow stiffly and excuse himself, citing a sudden indisposition with theatrical regret. A ripple of muffled laughter stirred the air, cruel as winter frost, and Eleanor felt the familiar blush of humiliation warm her cheeks despite her efforts to remain serenely unshaken. She retreated toward a marble pillar, seeking refuge in its silent strength, when the orchestral swell faltered and an unspoken hush threaded through the hall. Conversation softened, fans paused mid-flutter, and even the chandeliers seemed to pulse with wary anticipation. Through the grand entrance strode a figure whose very bearing commanded silence. His Grace, the Duke of Ravenska. He was tall, carved from authority and shadow, his presence both austere and magnetic. Dark eyes surveyed the assembly with a composure that bordered on indifference, yet beneath their calm glimmered a restrained fire, a depth spoken of only in rumor. Noble women inclined their heads, gentlemen bowed with quickened reverence, for he was a man whose approval could crown or condemn. Eleanor, accustomed to passing unnoticed, did not expect the weight of his gaze to settle upon her. Yet it did. Across the distance, his eyes lingered, steady, assessing, almost searching, as though he discerned in her quiet stillness an echo of something fiercely familiar. Eleanor's breath hitched, startled by the attention that buzzed along her spine like fragile electricity. She lowered her gaze out of instinctive modesty, yet the awareness of being truly seen unsettled the careful composure she had honed through seasons of disappointment. Whispered speculations swelled among the gathering, delicate as silk but sharp as thorns. "Why should the Duke regard her?" murmured a matron behind her fan. "Is he not known for his disdain?" another questioned. Eleanor pretended ignorance, though every syllable grazed her senses like faint, uninvited rain. The evening resumed its brittle gaiety, yet Eleanor's awareness remained tethered to that single commanding stare. When the master of ceremonies announced the next waltz, she expected to endure another polite refusal, another reminder of her ornamental irrelevance. Instead, footsteps advanced across the polished floor, deliberate, unhurried, resonant with authority. The Duke halted before her. Conversation stilled once more, and every gaze turned toward the improbable tableau assembling between them. He inclined his head with immaculate courtesy, his voice low, precise, and edged with courteous restraint. "Miss Ashcombe," he murmured, "may I trespass upon your solitude for this dance?" A tremor touched Eleanor's fingers as she considered the unthinkable honor. Around her, astonishment quivered like gathered breath. She sensed both hope and peril entwining in that singular moment, the cold memory of countless rejections warring against the fragile invitation offered now. With measured grace, she curtsied, her voice calm despite the storm beneath it. "Your Grace is excessively kind." His hand extended, gloved, unyielding, waiting. When she placed her own upon his palm, a current of quiet intensity surged through them, imperceptible to all except their hearts. He guided her toward the open floor, his posture composed, yet his gaze softened with a complexity she could not decipher. As the music embraced them, Eleanor's anxiety melted into cautious wonder. Each measured step felt like the quiet rewriting of a narrative long condemned. But it was not the dance alone that unsettled her. It was the solemn certainty in the Duke's eyes, the suggestion that he had crossed the breadth of expectation for reasons too deliberate to be dismissed. The waltz faded, applause murmured, and the Duke did not immediately release her hand. His thumb lingered faintly against her glove, a restrained pause that stole her breath more surely than any confession might dare. "You have endured much silence, Miss Ashcombe," he stated quietly, as though conferring a truth too intimate for careless ears. "I find no reason it should continue." The words settled between them like falling snow, cold, exquisite, irrevocable. Eleanor searched his face for mockery, for hidden cruelty, yet found only unwavering intention. Her heart hammered with cautious disbelief, aware that in that single sentence her carefully managed invisibility had been shattered. Beyond their measured composure, the ballroom watched, waiting for scandal, for folly, for proof that she would inevitably be undone by misplaced hope. Eleanor straightened, her chin rising with quiet resolve, even as uncertainty trembled within her ribs. The Duke bowed once more, a gesture both dignified and portentous, then withdrew, leaving behind a brittle void where his presence had lingered. Eleanor's pulse echoed like unspoken thunder, each heartbeat a reminder that something irrevocable had begun. As she turned toward the towering windows, moonlight tracing pale lines across her reflection, she sensed his gaze upon her once more, steady, resolute, unyielding. In that hushed stillness, she understood with sudden, trembling clarity that the Duke's attention was no passing courtesy, no idle whim of aristocratic amusement. It was a deliberate acknowledgment, and somewhere beneath the glittering cruelty of the room, Eleanor. Days passed in a delicate haze, and the echoes of Harrington Hall lingered in Eleanor Ashcombe's mind like the faint perfume of a long-forgotten bloom. The memory of the Duke's gaze, unwavering and precise, haunted her with the insistent quiet of a question unanswered. She moved through London society with practiced poise, yet every glance, every whisper seemed now infused with a new urgency. Invitations arrived and departed with equal care, the dance cards filled, the chatter swelling, yet she found herself caught in a gravity unseen by any but one. It began subtly. A single white rose, so pure in its simplicity that it seemed a contradiction to the ostentation of the city, appeared upon her dressing table one morning. No note accompanied it, no mark of sender, only the delicate fragrance, a quiet insistence that she had been noticed. Eleanor held the flower in her hands, fingertips tracing the fragile petals, and felt an odd flutter of apprehension mingled with hope. Perhaps it was nothing but an innocent gesture, a fancy of an anonymous admirer, but when she inhaled its soft perfume, her mind unavoidably returned to the Duke. Rumors, like slow-moving storms, began to gather. At tea with her mother, the gentle clinking of cups was underscored by a chorus of speculation. "I heard the Duke took particular note of you at the last ball," a cousin whispered, eyes glinting with curiosity and envy alike. Eleanor's lips curved in a faint, unreadable smile, but her pulse quickened beneath the measured calm of her composure. The very idea seemed preposterous. The Duke, aloof and imperious, did not grant attention lightly, and certainly not to a woman his society had deemed invisible. Yet attention grew persistent. At the Ashcombes' modest drawing-room, a small, leather-bound volume arrived, left upon the threshold with no introduction. Inside, the pages held lines of poetry both daring and delicate, passages that spoke of quiet fortitude and unacknowledged beauty. Eleanor's fingers lingered over the words, reading them again and again, each syllable a tether to a consciousness she could not dismiss. Who would dare send such sentiments, and why? Her rational mind urged caution, yet her heart could not deny the tremor of excitement that ran through her. Meanwhile, whispers swirled like smoke in the gilded corridors of London society. Ladies in high necks and fans pressed to lips speculated endlessly. He notices her? The eldest Ashcombe? Surely it is jest or pity, some said, while others muttered of intrigue, of scandal waiting to bloom. Her mother fretted openly, pressing her daughters to maintain impeccable decorum, warning that no woman survived a nobleman's notice without peril. Her sisters, meanwhile, exchanged sidelong glances, a mixture of astonishment and envy, their jewels catching the lamplight as they weighed what the consequences might be. Eleanor, aware of every word, felt an inner tightening of resolve. She would neither chase nor dismiss. She would observe, and let propriety guide her course. It was at the Duchess of Redmont's annual gallery opening that the first overt act of audacity occurred. Eleanor, as always, arrived in a modest gown of muted blue, a subtle grace that invited observation without ostentation. The Duke, against all expectation, was present, not as a distant figure of power, but intentionally, purposefully, close enough to be felt. As she moved among the portraits, He crossed the gallery floor and placed himself near her, yet never spoke immediately. A hush settled. Even the murmuring crowd felt the weight of a moment poised on the edge of scandal. And then, with no announcement, no flourish, the Duke reached into the folds of his coat and produced a single white rose, identical to the one she had received days before. His hand extended, placing it before her on the small, marble pedestal beside the paintings. The act was so simple, so deliberate, that it stunned the assembly into silence. A dozen eyes widened, a few lips parted in disbelief, yet no one dared interrupt. The gesture spoke louder than words ever could, a recognition, a challenge, an acknowledgment that Eleanor's place in society might no longer be what they had presumed. "May I presume, Miss Ashcombe," he said, voice low and smooth, "that solitude was never meant to be your companion?" The question hovered, delicate as mist, laden with possibility and danger alike. Eleanor felt her heart tighten, both afraid and elated. A dozen responses clamored within her mind, each weighed against propriety, against caution, against the soft-spoken dignity that had defined her for so many years. She inclined her head, voice measured, controlled, yet carrying the faint tremor of suppressed emotion. "Your Grace is excessively considerate," she replied, and the briefest hint of color touched her cheeks. Even as the gallery resumed its quiet hum, the consequences rippled outward. Servants whispered in corners, maids hurried to confirm tales, and society at large felt the tremor of attention where it had never existed before. Eleanor's family, long accustomed to her understated presence, found themselves suddenly thrust into a precarious position. Her mother's eyes flickered between pride and dread, while her sisters exchanged expressions of shock and speculation. Even the younger Ashcombes began to realize that the world, which had so long ignored Eleanor, now regarded her as something altogether different, a figure whose movements, gestures, and even silence held consequence. Yet Eleanor herself felt no triumph, only a strange mixture of anxiety and wonder. She recognized the audacity of the Duke's attention, the precariousness of being marked by a man whose power could elevate or destroy with equal ease. And beneath it all, a quiet, unspoken question persisted. Why her? Among the throngs of youthful beauty, among the daughters whose laughter sparkled like champagne, why did he seek the one whom society had dismissed? The evening concluded with a return to the familiar trappings of propriety, fêtes, carriage rides, and whispered consultations over teas and letters, but Eleanor found that nothing felt familiar. Every object, every glance, every whispered comment seemed imbued with the weight of a new reality. The tokens, the rose, the poetry, the deliberate attention, were not mere gestures. They were declarations, subtle yet unmistakable, that she had entered a sphere previously denied. As she retired to her chambers that night, candlelight flickering across polished wood and velvet drapes, Eleanor contemplated the thin line she now walked between hope and peril. The gifts, the attentions, the whispered speculations, all had shifted her world, transforming quiet endurance into a delicate, dangerous anticipation. She held the white rose in her hands once more, inhaling its faint fragrance, and allowed herself a moment of tremulous wonder. Perhaps, she thought, some doors, long closed to her, might now open. And yet, as the wind pressed against the window-panes and rain began to drum a soft, persistent rhythm upon the roof, Eleanor knew the greatest revelation had not been delivered by the gifts themselves. It was the certainty behind them, the measured intent, the deliberate courage of a man who had crossed the boundaries of expectation and propriety for her alone. That knowledge, more than any token or whispered rumor, unsettled her most profoundly. Outside, the city slumbered, oblivious to the quiet upheaval within the Ashcombe drawing-rooms. Inside, Eleanor traced the curve of the rose petals, and for the first time in years, allowed herself to consider that life might, after all, hold a measure of audacious possibility. Yet as she lowered her eyes and felt the tremor of awareness deep within her chest, she sensed that this was only the beginning. The Duke's attention was no idle fancy, no fleeting curiosity. It carried consequence, expectation, and an intensity that society would neither forgive nor ignore. And somewhere beyond the chambers, beyond the gilded streets of London, the Duke watched still, deliberate and unyielding, the faintest echo of a smile touching his lips as he considered how far he might go, and how far she might follow. The quiet tension of possibility hung heavy in the air, electric and unspoken, and Eleanor, holding the rose against her heart, understood with a mix of dread and exhilaration that nothing would ever be the same. Her solitude had been broken. The game had begun. A storm had claimed the night, drumming relentless upon the windows of Ravenska Manor, its cadence echoing through the long corridors as though the house itself held its breath. Eleanor Ashcombe had arrived under a veil of hesitant anticipation, escorted by the muted glow of lanterns that traced pools of light across the polished stone floors. She had scarcely dared to hope for this meeting, yet now, in the quiet sanctuary of the conservatory, she found herself standing before the Duke, the sound of rain blending with the muted tick of an ornate clock, marking the passage of moments pregnant with unspoken meaning. The room was fragrant with the scent of damp earth and the exotic blooms that thrived beneath glass panes, their petals glistening with moisture, reflecting the dim candlelight. Shadows danced upon the walls, casting elongated forms that mimicked the tension threading between them. Eleanor's fingers clutched the edges of her gloves, a nervous, unconscious anchor as she studied the Duke, who remained motionless, statuesque, yet imbued with a quiet expectancy that unsettled her. For a long moment, neither spoke. The storm outside raged with indifferent fury, a mirror to the storm that had been building in Eleanor's chest since their first encounter at Harrington Hall. She had rehearsed words, measured replies, polite denials of interest and curiosity alike, yet now, faced with the intensity of his gaze, her careful composure threatened to fracture. The Duke's dark eyes, intense and unwavering, seemed to pierce the very surface of her defenses, discerning the layers of resilience and quiet sorrow she had worn like armor for so many years. Finally, he spoke, his voice low, deliberate, carrying the weight of a confession withheld for too long. "Miss Ashcombe," he began, each word precise, yet softened by an intimacy reserved for moments beyond the reach of society's scrutiny, "I have watched you for many seasons, long before others even noticed your existence. It is not beauty alone, nor the transient favor of youth, that drew me, but the steadiness with which you endure the world's indifference. You bear your solitude with a grace few possess, and yet I see the tremor beneath your restraint. You are not invisible to me, Eleanor." Her breath caught, involuntary, a fleeting quiver that betrayed the calm she had meticulously maintained. She had anticipated admiration, fleeting curiosity, perhaps even pity, but not this, a declaration of recognition that was both overwhelming and intoxicating. Her heart threatened to betray her composure, yet she forced a small nod, measured, dignified, even as her mind raced to comprehend the gravity of his words. I am unaccustomed to such attention, Your Grace," she managed, voice steady despite the storm within. "And yet," she added, almost imperceptibly, "it is difficult to know how to respond when it is offered so freely, yet weighed with expectation." He stepped closer, the subtle shift of his presence enough to fill the conservatory with a charged intimacy. "Expectation," he said, the word both a statement and a question, "is what I have long abandoned. Yet truth is something I cannot relinquish. You have suffered the quiet cruelties of society with a dignity I have admired from afar, and I confess to you now, in this moment, that my regard for you is neither casual nor fleeting. It is deliberate. It is unshakable." Eleanor's pulse quickened, and a shiver of fear laced with desire coursed through her. The deliberate intimacy of his confession, the audacity of a man so accustomed to commanding the attention of all, left her simultaneously enthralled and wary. She searched his face for a glimmer of jest, for even the faintest cruelty, but found none, only the unyielding sincerity of a man who had placed his own heart upon the fragile altar of truth. "You speak boldly, Your Grace," she murmured, each syllable a careful negotiation between propriety and the undeniable stirrings of emotion. "Yet I cannot forget the consequences that accompany the notice of one such as yourself. A duke's favor is not given lightly, and its weight is formidable." He inclined his head slightly, acknowledging both her caution and her courage. "I am aware of the weight, Eleanor. I am aware of the worlds that might conspire against us should my intentions be known. And yet, it matters little to me if the world disapproves. I will not retract the truth of what I feel, nor the recognition I offer, because of fear or convention. You have endured enough silence. It is time for acknowledgment, even if it comes wrapped in risk." A tremor of something forbidden, something exquisitely dangerous, passed through Eleanor. She had lived years in the shadow of expectations, observing her sister's triumphs and her own exclusion with careful poise. And yet now, in this intimate moment, the rigid lattice of her restraint wavered. She felt the stirrings of hope, mingled with terror, for the intensity of his regard carried with it both possibility and peril. I scarcely know what to say," she confessed, her voice a soft echo of the storm outside. "Your words honor me, and yet they terrify me. For I have learned that admiration can as easily wound as it can elevate, and that intentions, no matter how noble, can be misread." He reached out, barely, a hand hovering near hers without closing the distance fully, respecting the delicate proprieties that had guided their lives. "Then allow me to be clear," he said, deliberate, measured, yet suffused with quiet intensity. "I do not wish merely to admire. I do not wish to entertain fancy or curiosity. My regard is neither trivial nor whimsical. It is an acknowledgment of your worth, a recognition of the strength, resilience, and unspoken beauty that the world has long denied. I seek nothing of you but honesty, Eleanor, and the permission to be known by you, in turn." Her chest constricted, the weight of his declaration pressing upon her heart with both exhilaration and fear. 4 years, she had navigated the cruel calculus of society, measured every word, every gesture, every glance with precision. And yet here was a man, the most formidable and commanding presence in England, discarding calculation entirely in favor of truth. Eleanor began, faltering, then drew a slow, steadying breath. "You honor me more than I deserve, Your Grace. Yet I cannot help but wonder if such attention might bring ruin as easily as it brings recognition. I have endured enough whispers, enough assumptions, to know that the world is rarely kind to those it notices late or unexpectedly." The Duke's eyes softened, the shadow of a fleeting vulnerability crossing his otherwise unassailable countenance. "Then let us endure it together," he said, voice low, intimate, and compelling. "If the world seeks to judge, let us meet it with integrity. If society whispers, let our truth speak louder. I would rather navigate its perils with you than witness your worth ignored a single day longer." A shiver of understanding passed through Eleanor, a mingling of awe, relief, and fear. The intensity of his declaration, the courage required to place his heart so openly upon the table, demanded a response she could scarcely formulate. Yet the power of recognition, of being seen so fully, was intoxicating, and for the first time in years she felt the faintest flutter of hope within her chest. The storm outside softened, rain sliding down glass panes like tears of quiet revelation. The room, once defined by shadow and candlelight, now felt suffused with the weight of unspoken possibilities. Eleanor's hand hovered near the empty space between them, tempted by connection, yet restrained by propriety and caution alike. She began again, her voice barely above a whisper. "I do not know if I am prepared for what you offer, but I will not deny its truth. I am grateful to be seen." The Duke inclined his head, acknowledging the confession with a gentle solemnity, the barest curve of a smile touching his lips. "Then it is enough," he said, voice both comforting and unyielding. "The rest will follow in time." And as the rain softened to a steady patter, Eleanor understood, with a mixture of fear and exhilaration, that the course of her life had shifted irreversibly. The Duke's acknowledgment was no fleeting fancy. It was a declaration, a reckoning, a promise of upheaval and transformation. The consequences, though not yet fully revealed, loomed inevitable, yet tantalizing in their enormity. A single candle flickered, casting a delicate shadow across their faces, and Eleanor felt, for the first time, the exquisite tension of vulnerability embraced. In that suspended moment, where fear and hope coexisted, she realized that nothing could remain unchanged. Outside, the storm whispered its final, uncertain notes, and within the conservatory, two hearts poised on the precipice of revelation understood that the private confession had altered everything. The grand hall of Redmont Manor glittered beneath the weight of 1,000 candles, their golden light spilling over gilded moldings, crystal chandeliers, and the polished marble floors that reflected 1,000 small, trembling images of society's most accomplished daughters. Eleanor Ashcombe moved through the crowd with cautious elegance, her gown a muted sapphire, understated yet impossibly graceful. Whispers trailed in her wake, half curiosity, half judgment, for tonight she would face the culmination of months of subtle scandal, unspoken tension, and the dangerous attention of England's most formidable nobleman, the Duke of Ravenska. Music swelled, a waltz both familiar and charged, weaving between guests whose eyes flitted to and fro, measuring, murmuring, calculating. Eleanor's heart beat in quiet tandem with the melody, a rhythm that threatened both excitement and dread. She had long rehearsed her comportment, poised for civility, prepared to endure the scrutiny of both family and society. Yet beneath her calm, a storm of emotion surged, a potent mixture of anticipation, fear, and the fragile hope that the Duke's intentions were no mere flourish. Her sisters floated by on the arms of titled lords, radiant and composed, oblivious to the quiet tension that had settled upon Eleanor's shoulders. Even her mother's eyes flickered nervously, betraying the anxiety she had suppressed in polite society. This was a night of judgment, yet it was also a night of opportunity, and the air thrummed with the electric possibility of revelation. Eleanor's gaze, however, sought only one figure, the Duke, whose presence was both commanding and imperceptibly expectant, a subtle gravity drawing attention as inexorably as the moon pulls the tide. Then he appeared, cutting through the assembly with a deliberate ease that silenced murmurs and stilled the frivolity of gossip. His dark eyes found Eleanor's, unwavering, and for a moment the hall seemed to shrink around them, the chatter dissolving into an almost sacred hush. He approached, his movements precise, measured, yet carrying the undercurrent of a man who had long commanded the obedience of others yet now acted with uncharacteristic humility. "Miss Ashcombe," he said, voice low but carrying clearly over the subdued murmurs of the assembly, "may I have this dance?" A ripple of astonishment passed through the hall. Heads turned, whispers rose and fell like delicate waves, for the Duke's attention was a force of consequence. And yet Eleanor's heart, steady though it appeared, thrummed with a quiet shock. She had anticipated acknowledgment, perhaps even admiration, but not this, a public declaration of interest, precise, unyielding, and unignorable. She inclined her head with measured grace, her voice a gentle cadence that nonetheless drew every ear in her vicinity. "Your Grace honors me far beyond what I could have hoped." He extended his hand, gloved and unyielding, and she placed her own within it, the contact electric in its subtlety. As they moved into the center of the hall, the orchestra swelled, and the waltz began, each step a quiet defiance of society's expectations, each turn a delicate assertion of presence that no whisper could diminish. Eleanor's composure remained impeccable, yet beneath her serene exterior, her chest swelled with a tension she could neither suppress nor entirely comprehend. The Duke guided her with the utmost care, his hand firm yet gentle, his gaze never wavering. He spoke in measured tones, words meant for her ears alone despite the throng surrounding them. "It is not pity, Miss Ashcombe, nor the passing fancy of the indifferent that brings me to you tonight. It is recognition. It is intention. I kneel before you, not as one bowing to convention, but as one acknowledging what has long been invisible to others yet undeniable to me." A collective gasp rippled across the room. Even the most composed of guests felt the audacity, the scandalous implication of his words. To kneel, publicly, before a woman deemed past the age of societal favor, was to challenge the very hierarchy of propriety, to rewrite the rules of expectation with a gesture both simple and monumental. Eleanor's breath caught, and for the first time that evening, the music seemed to fade, leaving only the gravity of his acknowledgment suspended between them. She felt the weight of countless eyes upon her, yet for the first time in her life, it did not diminish her. Instead, it crystallized her awareness of her own worth, a realization long denied by society's casual cruelty. The Duke's gaze held her still, commanding, yet gentle, a paradox that left her both awed and unsteady. She lifted her chin, voice composed, carrying a quiet strength that surprised even herself. "Your Grace's confidence unsettles me, yet I find it compelling." He inclined his head slightly, a shadow of a smile brushing his lips. "Compelling, yes, but not imposed. You are free to accept what you find worthy, and to reject what you cannot yet trust. My role is only to be honest in the recognition that has long been withheld from you." Each step of the waltz became a declaration, each turn a subtle confrontation of the prejudices Eleanor had endured all her life. She moved with grace, her heart bound by tension, hope, and a dawning comprehension that her life might be irrevocably altered by this single audacious act. The hall itself seemed to bend around them, the chandeliers casting long, trembling reflections across the polished floor, magnifying the significance of their shared space. When the music faltered, nearing its conclusion, the Duke did not release her hand. His thumb brushed faintly against hers, a quiet reassurance, an unspoken promise. "Eleanor," he said, voice carrying the weight of inevitability, "I offer not a fleeting regard, nor a superficial honor. I offer acknowledgment, steadfast, deliberate, and unassailable. I ask you, here and now, to consider what it might mean to be seen as you deserve, irrespective of society's whispers and judgments." Her heart stilled and then surged with a delicate thrill of recognition. This was no mere gesture of flirtation, no polite acknowledgment of passing curiosity. It was a declaration that transcended propriety, a challenge to the expectations that had so long confined her. Eleanor's mind raced, weighing desire against caution, hope against fear, yet her body, poised and deliberate, betrayed the faintest shiver of anticipation. "Your Grace," she whispered, voice trembling yet dignified, "it is overwhelming, and yet I cannot deny the truth of your words. I have long endured silence, and now, to be seen, it is astonishing." The Duke's gaze softened, the shadow of vulnerability touching his otherwise imperious features. "Then accept it, Eleanor. Let the world bear witness to what it has long denied, the worth of a woman seen, acknowledged, and valued not for her station, her fortune, or her youth, but for the strength and dignity she embodies." The room around them remained a blur of gaslight, silk, and murmurs, yet Eleanor felt only the weight and warmth of his attention, the deliberate gravity of a declaration that could neither be ignored nor withdrawn. She inclined her head, eyes lifting to meet his fully for the first time that evening, and allowed herself the smallest, most deliberate acknowledgment. "I accept your regard, your Grace, and I shall meet it as honorably as I can." A hush fell over the hall as the last note of the orchestra faded, leaving in its place a silence more powerful than music, more profound than decorum. Guests whispered, eyes wide with astonishment, for the Duke's audacity had rewritten expectation in a single, sweeping gesture. Eleanor, once invisible, now carried the quiet triumph of recognition, the validation of her long-silenced worth. And as the candles flickered, casting delicate shadows across her gown and the polished floor, Eleanor understood that this moment was both culmination and beginning, the apex of public declaration, yet the threshold of private revelation and the unknown path that lay beyond. She felt the thrilling, tremulous uncertainty of love acknowledged, of a future rewritten, and of a society compelled to bear witness to what it had long denied. Beyond the murmur of applause and astonishment, the Duke remained at her side, steadfast, unyielding, and resolute, a silent pledge of intent and protection. And in that suspended moment, Eleanor realized that nothing could return to its former course. The world would watch, judge, and whisper, yet their bond, delicate and daring, had been declared in a manner both scandalous and irrevocable. As she turned her gaze toward the gallery's grand windows, moonlight tracing silver across the marble floors, Eleanor felt the faintest tremor of anticipation, fear, and exhilaration. Outside, London slept, unaware of the quiet upheaval within Redmont Manor. Within, she held the intoxicating knowledge that recognition had been granted, that courage had been shown, and that the consequences of audacious truth were only beginning to unfold. And in that hushed, electric stillness, Eleanor understood with sudden clarity. Her life had shifted irreversibly, and the Duke's devotion, now publicly declared, would demand choices, courage, and an endurance she had only just begun to fathom. Spring had finally arrived in London, though the city remained veiled in the delicate mist of early morning, streets glistening with the faint sheen of overnight rain. Eleanor Ashcombe stepped from her carriage at Ravenska Manor, the soft rustle of her gown mingling with the quiet hum of awakening servants. Today, the hall would not merely host another ball or gathering. Today would mark the culmination of months of whispered attention, deliberate gestures, and the careful unraveling of society's expectations. Her heart, steady yet thrumming beneath her ribcage, knew the significance of what awaited, the Duke's final declaration, the moment where private intention would confront public consequence. Inside, the manor was a cathedral of light and anticipation. Candles sparkled in crystal holders, reflecting in polished marble and gilded mirrors, while the faint scent of lilies and roses infused the air, sweet and almost dizzying. The orchestra's rehearsal hummed through the halls, soft notes threading into the quiet murmur of arriving guests. Each guest seemed acutely aware that this was no ordinary gathering. Whispers carried through corridors like eager birds, some admiring, some scandalized, yet all present to witness a drama that promised both audacity and revelation. Eleanor's sisters arrived before her, adorned in gowns of opulent color, their eyes flicking toward her with a mixture of envy, astonishment, and the tentative pride that only family could claim. They had been trained in the art of societal triumph, yet even they seemed tentative under the weight of this evening's import. Eleanor's mother followed closely, her expression taut with anxiety, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted a sleeve or smoothed a ribbon, all in service to propriety. Eleanor, by contrast, moved with quiet determination, her posture straight, her gaze calm, yet beneath it lay the taut wire of anticipation that she alone fully comprehended. At the far end of the hall, the Duke of Ravenska waited. He had chosen the most visible position, standing beneath the arch of crystal chandeliers, dark attire absorbing the light in contrast to the golden glow surrounding him. His presence commanded attention, as it always did, yet tonight it was tempered with deliberate vulnerability, a softening that only Eleanor could recognize. He did not approach yet. He allowed the room and the ritual of entrance to unfold, knowing that the impact of his eventual gesture would be magnified by the anticipation he carefully cultivated. As Eleanor entered the hall, the orchestra swelled in recognition of her arrival. She walked with measured grace, each step a quiet assertion that she had endured, that she had been seen, and that she now claimed the attention previously withheld. Conversations faltered, eyes followed her, and a hush settled over the assembly, delicate yet palpable. Even her sister's smiles were tempered with awe, for Eleanor, once the overlooked eldest, now held the weight of inevitability upon her. She approached the center of the hall, where the Duke's gaze met hers, steady, commanding, and yet unmistakably tender. He moved toward her, deliberate and unhurried, the soft echo of his boots upon the marble announcing his presence like a prelude to declaration. When he stopped before her, the room seemed to contract, the crowd fading into muted silhouettes. His voice, low yet carrying across the hushed assembly, pronounced her name with a gravity that silenced all murmurs. "Eleanor Ashcombe," he said, each syllable deliberate, resonant. "I stand before you not as a man obeying convention, nor as one swayed by mere propriety. I kneel before you, not in pity, nor in jest, but in recognition of what has long been denied, your worth, your dignity, and the quiet strength that no society could obscure." A ripple of astonishment passed through the crowd. Gentlemen froze mid-bow, ladies clutched fans to lips in disbelief, and even the orchestra faltered as if the universe itself held its breath. Eleanor felt the weight of his declaration settle upon her shoulders, heavy with consequence, yet imbued with the clarity of truth. Her pulse raced, yet her composure, honed over years of observation and quiet endurance, held firm. She knelt as he did not. She did not need to mirror him, for her acknowledgment alone sufficed, but allowed herself to meet his gaze fully, unwavering. The Duke continued, voice unwavering, "I have observed you through seasons of dismissal and disregard, noting the dignity with which you bore the weight of neglect and social expectation. Tonight, I place my regard before all who would doubt your value. Will you accept what has been long due, Eleanor? Will you allow the world to witness the truth of your worth, unbound by whispers or propriety?" Eleanor's breath caught, the hall spinning into a suspended moment where all anticipation, fear, and longing coalesced. Her eyes swept across the room, sensing the charged attention of society, yet she felt only the Duke's deliberate gaze upon her. She knew that acceptance would alter not only her life but the lives of all who had underestimated her, who had dismissed her quietly for years. Yet in that realization lay a quiet power, a triumph she had long been denied. With a steadying breath, she raised her chin and spoke, voice clear, measured, yet touched by emotion that softened the edges of formality. "Your Grace, I accept your regard, not lightly, not without thought, but with the awareness that truth cannot be denied, and that recognition, long withheld, is a treasure worth embracing." A murmur of astonishment swept the room, the Duke inclining his head slightly in acknowledgment, the faintest trace of a smile softening his otherwise commanding visage. He reached for her hand, not merely to guide or to possess, but to affirm, to honor, to establish a bond tempered by respect, admiration, and shared vulnerability. Eleanor felt the warmth of intention in the gesture, the quiet promise embedded within the grasp of fingers that spoke of fidelity and acknowledgment. The crowd exhaled collectively, their astonishment transforming into a tense, respectful awe. Whispers now carried not judgment but recognition, tentative yet inevitable, of a moment both scandalous and majestic. Her family's faces reflected shock, pride, and a hesitant relief, For Eleanor had not only endured the scrutiny of months but had now claimed her position in a society that had long ignored her. Music resumed, lighter now, a delicate minuet underscoring the gravity of the moment. Eleanor allowed herself a glance toward the Duke, his expression steady, resolute, yet softened by the subtle acknowledgment of shared triumph. In that gaze lay the promise of partnership, of intimacy bound not by circumstance but by deliberate mutual recognition. Her heart swelled, understanding that this act, public yet profoundly private, had rewritten the trajectory of her life. Even as she moved through the final steps of the dance, each motion carried purpose, each gesture a reclamation of dignity. Eleanor felt the thrill of possibility, the intoxicating knowledge that she was no longer merely observed, but acknowledged, chosen, and honored. The Duke's attentiveness, steadfast and deliberate, served as both shield and confirmation, a promise that recognition would endure beyond the scrutiny of the crowd. As the final notes of the orchestra faded into silence, Eleanor and the Duke stood side by side, the room holding its breath in the aftermath of audacity realized. Candles flickered, casting delicate shadows upon marble floors, gilded mirrors, and the faces of astonished witnesses. Eleanor understood with clarity that life would never return to its prior course. Recognition had been granted, dignity restored, and the world compelled to witness what it had long denied. Yet amid the triumph, Eleanor felt the faintest tremor of uncertainty, a thrill of anticipation for the challenges that would inevitably follow, the judgments to be faced, the delicate negotiations of propriety and desire. She had been acknowledged, celebrated even, but the future remained uncharted, alive with possibility and peril alike. The Duke's hand brushed hers, deliberate, grounding, intimate, yet measured. "Tonight," he whispered, barely audible above the quiet exhalation of society, "is but the beginning. Whatever follows, we shall face it together, with courage and truth." Eleanor's chest rose and fell, the tension of months dissolving into a fragile, exhilarating release. She inclined her head, eyes meeting his fully, and allowed herself a smile that was both acknowledgment and promise, a quiet reflection of the triumph achieved and the journey yet to come. And as moonlight traced silver paths across the polished floors, Eleanor understood the truth she had long awaited. Her life had been irrevocably transformed, her worth no longer a question, and her future poised upon the delicate edge of audacious possibility. The storm of society's whispers had been met, her dignity intact, yet beyond the hall, beyond the gaze of all observers, the full measure of their challenge remained, a thrilling, uncertain horizon awaiting the first deliberate step.